Hi, I'm Natasha Stott Despoja, and it's a privilege to join this discussion today, albeit virtually, all about how we can rise up and reset and reshape the world so that it's a fairer, greener place, especially for women and girls. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and speak, and that's the Kaurna people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and any elders from other communities who may be present or listening today. It's an honour to be a member of the Arise Leadership Circle. Our job is to raise, yes, awareness of the good work that ActionAid does, but also raise much needed funds. I've been so lucky to see the first-hand work of ActionAid. This is an organisation that is on the front line. It's changing lives. It's literally saving lives. Whether it's in Vanuatu, where I've seen the good work of developing resilience for women, or more importantly, putting women front and centre of decision making, whether it comes to disaster preparedness or risk reduction or rebuilding communities. I've seen ActionAid at the International Humanitarian Summit in Turkey, where they were flying the flag for women being a central part of foreign policy and international development. And we're not just talking about a seat at the table or being consulted, but women playing a pivotal role. I've also most recently seen ActionAid's work in Bangladesh, when we all could travel, and to see that unfolding humanitarian crisis that is Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, or to meet with women in Bangladesh in some of the most really remote parts of the world who are dealing with the real brunt of climate change and the climate crisis. So thank you, ActionAid, for the work that you do. You know better than anyone that women and girls really have a disproportionate impact of any crisis. They are disproportionately affected. And of course, this pandemic is no different. We know that women and girls are affected more so, but also those groups who are traditionally marginalised, so those living in poverty or people with disabilities. Their lives have been made worse by this pandemic. We know that COVID-19 has affected men and women differently. Rupert Dart of the Global Women in Health Network says women are the shock absorbers of this pandemic. And she's right. You only have to look at the social, economic, and other effects, including health effects on women. We know that there's been an amplification of traditional gender roles. We know that women have literally been at the front line of this crisis, performing tasks and work, including in the healthcare sector, where women comprise a majority of those frontline workers, right through to cleaners and other community and welfare work. We know that women's burden in relation to unpaid care and labour has spiked. It's increased. We also know that women have borne the brunt of the economic impact. So when it comes to job losses, economic uncertainty, economic insecurity. And an area in which I'm involved is the issue of prevention of violence against women and children in Australia, but increasingly looking at the work around the world. And one thing we know from this global pandemic is that women in Australia, women in our region, and women across the world have experienced an increase in violence. The severity of violence has increased. COVID has been weaponised as a coercive tool. First-time experiences of violence have increased. We know that the nature of this violence, there's a myriad, isn't there? Those forms of violence include everything from domestic and family violence, sexual harassment, sexual assault, racism, institutional neglect, and indeed technologically facilitated or assisted abuse. So in Australia, for example, online, so-called, online revenge porn, the reports of that have increased by around 200% on average. We also know this is true across the world. So you can see one of the most disturbing consequences of this pandemic has been the impact on women in terms of their physical and other safety. The Deputy Director of UN Women, Anita Bhatia, says, "The very technique we are using to protect people from the virus can perversely impact victims of domestic violence, and we know what that means. Victims of this violence, usually women and children, are trapped in their homes with their abusers, often with little access to power or help or any other forms of assistance. So we know that. We know in terms of the workforce that this pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated existing inequalities. We also know that women have had to deal with an unfair burden of care for older relatives as well as children. And this is having a huge impact and exacerbating some of those traditional gender norms and stereotypes, particularly as a consequence of people being confined to their homes. We find that in times of crisis that gender roles can be reasserted, and there's a revision or a reversion, if you like, to traditional gender roles. This phenomenon can also mean that men's role as leaders and decision makers can be further normalised and promoted, something we have to guard against, especially when you look at the different countries that have handled COVID arguably better than most. What do they have in common? Many of them have female leaders. However, this crisis does bring opportunities, and I think that our response on a global level is one that could hopefully change and reshape and reset the world for women. We could embed policies that genuinely promote gender equality. We could argue that women have a much, much more important role in decision making. We can start to reimagine and revalue those traditionally female-dominated industries and sectors, those feminized industries, if you like. We can start to reward and remunerate properly those roles such as childcare workers and teachers. We should be looking at universal childcare across the board and ways that we can support women when it comes to balancing their work and their lives. We can start to introduce economic stimulus measures that really value women, and we can apply a gender lens to policy and decision making across the world. We've got to support women on the front line of crises as well, ensuring that they have the capacity and the resources to respond to and to prepare for the growing impacts of natural disasters, but also climate change. So it's time to rise up and support women in order to rebuild a fairer world. So supporting ActionAid's Giving Day today is one way that we can invest in women and girls, and we can actually ensure that we drive change that's urgently needed in communities. Together, we can invest in women to rise up, reset, and rebuild and reshape. Will you rise up with us?